Saffron Cole had exactly 14 minutes left as the person she used to be. She just didn't know it yet. The waterfront warehouse sat at the dead end of Pier 19, where the East River lapped against concrete pillars and the city lights reflected off black water like scattered coins. From the outside, the building looked like every other logistics depot along the harbor. Corrugated steel walls, loading bay doors wide enough for shipping containers, and a faded sign that read, "Atlantic Crown Freight Solutions." Nothing about it would make a person look twice, but Saffron had looked twice. She had looked 3 times, actually, because the numbers running through the company's private ledgers didn't add up, and numbers were the one language she spoke better than English. She was 26 years old, 5'6", with dark brown skin and tight coils of black hair she kept pulled back with a single clip when she was working. Tonight, that clip was barely holding. Her fingers had been shaking for the last 20 minutes, ever since she realized what she was actually looking at on that screen. She had been hired 3 weeks ago as a contract auditor, a temporary position. Clean up the quarterly filings, reconcile the accounts, submit the report, collect the check. Simple. She had done this kind of work for a dozen mid-level firms across the city. Walk in, fix the math, walk out. The problem was that this math wasn't broken. It was hidden. Buried inside 4 layers of shell accounts and routing numbers that looped through holding companies in 3 different states, Saffron had found a second set of books. A real set. The kind that showed where the actual money moved, amounts so large they made the official filings look like pocket change. She should have closed the laptop right then. She should have stood up, walked to the elevator, badged out through the lobby, and never come back. Instead, she copied the files onto her portable drive. That was 9 minutes ago. Now she was standing in the middle of a private office on the warehouse's top floor, surrounded by 4 men in dark suits who had appeared so fast she hadn't even heard the door open. The room smelled like polished wood and salt air. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the harbor. A massive oak desk sat in the center, and behind it, in a leather chair that didn't make a single sound when he moved, sat the man who owned everything in this building, and apparently a lot more. Derek Malone. She had seen his name on exactly 2 documents during her 3 weeks here. Both times it had been buried in footnotes. No photo on the company website, no interviews, no public profile of any kind. He was the kind of man who existed in signatures and wire transfers, and nothing else. Looking at him now, she understood why. He was tall, she could tell even with him seated, with broad shoulders and a jawline that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the building's foundation. His skin was deep brown, his head clean-shaved, and his eyes were so dark they reflected the harbor lights like 2 chips of obsidian. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the collar open at the throat, and his hands rested flat on the desk in front of him, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't look angry. That was the part that scared her most. "Miss Cole," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man reading the weather forecast. "Do you know what you copied?" Saffron's throat went dry. She thought about lying. She thought about playing dumb, pretending she had grabbed the wrong folder, saying she didn't understand what the files contained. But his eyes told her he already knew every move she had made for the last hour, probably longer. Lying to this man felt like trying to hide behind glass. "I saw the second ledger," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I wasn't looking for it. The reconciliation flagged the discrepancies automatically. I followed the trail." Derek studied her for a long moment. Then he extended one hand, palm up. "Your drive." She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the small black device, and placed it in his hand. His fingers closed around it, and it disappeared. "Your phone." She hesitated. Her phone was her lifeline. Contacts, banking apps, her apartment keycal, everything. "Miss Cole." His tone didn't change. It didn't need to. She handed it over. "Your badge." The company ID badge hung around her neck on a lanyard. She pulled it off and set it on the desk. The photo on it stared back at her. It already felt like a picture of someone else. Derek placed all 3 items in his desk drawer and closed it with a soft click. Then he looked past her to the tallest of the 4 men standing behind her. "Escort Miss Cole off the premises. She leaves with what she's wearing. Nothing else." The tall man nodded once. Saffron blinked. "That's it?" Derek's gaze returned to her. For a fraction of a second, so brief she almost missed it, something moved behind those dark eyes, something she couldn't name. "That's it," he said. "Go." She waited for the catch, the threat, the part where someone explained what would happen to her if she talked, if she went to authorities, if she told anyone what she had seen. In every movie she had ever watched, this was the moment where things got dangerous. Instead, the tall man stepped aside and gestured toward the door. A second man was already holding it open. Saffron walked, down the hallway, into the freight elevator, through the loading bay, past the security gate. Each step felt like crossing a bridge that was disappearing behind her. When the cold night air hit her face, she gasped. The gate clanged shut at her back. She stood on the empty sidewalk with no phone, no money, no identification, and no way to get into her own apartment. She pulled her jacket tight and started walking toward the city lights, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She thought she had just barely survived the worst night of her life. She was wrong about that. 6 blocks behind her, inside the office she had just left, Derek Malone picked up a secure phone and dialed a single number. "File the syndicate matrimonial seal tonight," he said. "Use her new identity. I want her former name scrubbed from every database we touch before sunrise." The voice on the other end paused. "Sir, a protection seal of that level, that's a binding contract. It ties her to your household permanently. Are you certain?" Derek turned his chair toward the window. Somewhere out there, a woman with no money and no name was walking into the dark, thinking she had lost everything. He watched the city lights flicker on the water. "She saw the books and didn't run," he said quietly. "She stood in front of me and told the truth when lying would have been easier. Do you know how many people in my life have done that?" Silence on the line. "None." He set the phone down. "Get it done." By the time Saffron reached the first intersection and looked back over her shoulder at the empty street behind her, the most powerful man on the eastern seaboard had already decided 3 things. She would never be found by his enemies. She would never need money again. And before the month was over, she would carry his name. Saffron found $3.47 in the bottom of her jacket pocket. 2 crumpled singles, a quarter, 2 dimes, and 2 pennies, pressed between a folded receipt and a stick of gum she didn't remember buying. She counted the coins twice under the fluorescent lights of a crosswalk, standing on the corner of 42nd and Lexington, while the morning rush poured around her like river water splitting around a rock. She had walked all night. Her shoes, flat-soled office loafers meant for carpet and tile, had rubbed raw patches onto both heels by the time she crossed into Midtown. Her jacket was too thin for October air, and her fingers had gone numb somewhere around hour 4. She had ducked into the vestibule of a closed laundromat near Hell's Kitchen around 3 in the morning and sat on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the dark street through the glass door, trying to organize her thoughts into something useful. Her apartment was 17 blocks north, but without her phone, she couldn't access the digital gap. The building manager kept a spare, but his office didn't open until 9, and she had no way to prove her identity without her wallet, which was locked in her desk drawer back at the warehouse. She could try calling her sister in Virginia from a payphone, except payphones barely existed anymore, and the few that did charged more than $3 for a long-distance call. She had no credit cards, no transit pass, and as of 6 hours ago, apparently no job. Everything she owned in the world was the clothing on her body and $3.47. Grand Central Terminal opened its doors at 5:15. Saffron walked inside and let the warmth settle over her like a blanket. The main concourse was already filling with early commuters, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors and bouncing up toward that painted ceiling with its green and gold constellations. She had passed through this building 1,000 times on the way to somewhere else. Today, she had nowhere else to be. A small diner sat tucked into the corner of a side corridor on the lower level, the kind of place that served eggs and coffee to transit workers and cab drivers at hours when the rest of the city was still sleeping. The sign above the counter read, "Hanks," in faded red letters, and the woman behind the register had the tired, patient face of someone who had been pouring coffee since before sunrise for the last 30 years. "Just coffee," Saffron said, sliding $1.25 across the counter. "Cream and sugars at the end," the woman said, without looking up. Saffron carried her cup to a corner booth and sat with her back to the wall. The coffee was burned and bitter and absolutely perfect. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let the heat sink into her palms while she tried to think. She needed a plan, something practical and immediate. Step 1 was getting into her apartment. Step 2 was pulling together whatever cash she had at home. Step 3, she wasn't sure about Step 3 yet, but it probably involved getting as far from New York as possible before anyone from Atlantic Crown Freight Solutions came looking for her. If they came looking. She kept replaying the moment in that office. Derek Malone's face when he told her to leave. The way he said, "Go," like he was releasing a bird from a cage rather than throwing out a security risk. Every instinct she had told her that a man running books like that didn't just let witnesses walk away. There had to be something she was missing, a piece she couldn't see. She took a long sip of coffee and watched the diner fill up around her. A construction worker ordered a bacon sandwich. 2 nurses in scrubs split a plate of toast. A teenager with a backpack sat at the counter doing homework. Ordinary people living ordinary mornings. Saffron envied every single one of them. She didn't notice the black SUV parked on the street above her, directly across from the terminal's east entrance. Inside the vehicle, 2 men sat in silence. The one in the passenger seat held a tablet showing a live feed from 3 different angles inside Grand Central, each camera positioned to cover a separate exit. The driver spoke into a small earpiece, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's in the lower level. Corner booth at the diner. Alone." The response came back, clipped and immediate. "Hold position. Visual only."
"She doesn't get approached."
"Understood."
20 feet from the SUV, 2 men in overcoats entered the terminal through the east doors. They moved with purpose, shoulders squared, scanning the concourse the way people do when they're looking for someone specific. The taller one checked his phone, showed the screen to his partner, and gestured toward the staircase leading to the lower level. Inside the SUV, the passenger tapped his earpiece. "We've got company. 2 from the Hargrove faction, east entrance, heading down." A pause, then, "Intercept. Keep it quiet." The 2 men from the SUV stepped out onto the sidewalk and crossed the street at an easy pace, timing their entry through the east doors to arrive at the top of the staircase at the exact moment the 2 overcoated men reached it. What happened next took less than 40 seconds. A brief conversation, too low for anyone passing by to hear. One of the SUV men produced a phone and showed something on its screen. The taller, overcoated man stiffened. His partner put a hand on his arm. Another exchange of words. Then, both overcoated men turned around and walked back out through the east doors without ever setting foot on the lower level. They climbed into a gray sedan parked on Lexington and pulled away. Inside the diner, Saffron finished her coffee. She stared into the empty cup for a long time, turning over her options. The diner was warm and the booth was comfortable, and she had $2.22 left, which meant she could afford one more hour of sitting here before the guilt of taking up space without ordering pushed her back out into the cold. She pressed her fingertips against her eyes and exhaled. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Okay, figure it out." She stood, zipped her jacket, and walked toward the staircase leading back up to the main concourse. She passed the exact spot where, 90 seconds earlier, 2 men had been turned away from finding her. The marble floor was clean, and the air smelled like coffee and floor polish, and the footsteps of 100 strangers echoed around her. Saffron climbed the stairs and disappeared into the crowd, still believing she was completely alone. Saffron walked for 6 hours to cross into New Jersey. She couldn't afford a cab, the subway required a Metro card she didn't have, and the PATH train was out of the question without funds. So she walked. West through Midtown, down through the Holland Tunnel pedestrian access, and into Jersey City with aching legs and a blister on her left heel that had gone from painful to numb somewhere around mile 3. By the time she reached Newark, the sun was starting to drop behind the industrial skyline, and her stomach had been empty long enough that the hunger had turned into a dull, heavy weight sitting just below her ribs. She had spent her last $1.70 on a bottle of water from a bodega near Journal Square, which meant she was now carrying exactly 52 cents to her name. The Greyhound Depot on Raymond Boulevard was a long, flat building with tinted windows and fluorescent lighting that buzzed loud enough to hear from the sidewalk. Saffron pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the smell of floor cleaner and diesel exhaust. The waiting area was half full, a woman stretched across plastic chairs, a man in a military jacket reading a paperback, a group of college students sharing a bag of chips near the vending machines. Saffron stood just inside the entrance and studied the departure board mounted above the ticket counter. Buses heading south left every few hours. Richmond at 8:15, Raleigh at 9:40, Charlotte at 11. The prices listed next to each destination made her stomach tighten. Even the cheapest seat was $60, and she was $60 short of $60. She needed to think of something. Her plan, loose as it was, had formed during the long walk across the river. She would head south, Virginia, maybe the Carolinas, somewhere far enough from New York that whatever Derek Malone's organization might want with her would become more trouble than it was worth. She had a cousin in Roanoke she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, and a college roommate who had moved to Wilmington after graduation. If she could just get on a bus, she could figure out the rest from there. The problem was the $60, and the fact that she had no identification. She approached the ticket counter slowly, already preparing the story in her head. She would say her wallet was stolen. She would ask if there was a way to book a seat and pay on arrival, or use some kind of emergency assistance program, or anything at all that didn't require money she didn't have. The man behind the counter was in his 50s, heavy-set, with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and a name tag that said Gerald. He was typing something into his computer when Saffron reached the window. "Hi," she said. "I'm in a bit of a situation. I lost my wallet and I'm trying to get south. Is there any way I could—" Gerald looked up from his screen. His eyes moved over her face for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. He held up one finger. "Hold on, let me check something." He typed a few keystrokes, squinted at the monitor, then reached below the counter and pulled out a white envelope. It was sealed, with nothing written on the outside. "Are you headed to Charlotte?" he asked. Saffron blinked. What?" "Charlotte, the 11 o'clock. Gerald opened the envelope and slid a printed ticket across the counter. "First-class seat, paid in full." Saffron stared at the ticket. It was printed on standard Greyhound stock, with a departure time, a seat number, and a name she had never seen before. Mara Ellison. "I think there's been a mistake," she said. "That's not my name." Gerald glanced at his screen again, then back at her. His face was perfectly neutral, the way a man looks when he's been told to do something and has decided not to ask questions about it. "Ma'am, this ticket was purchased earlier today. Cash. The gentleman who bought it said you'd be coming in this evening and that you might not have your documents with you. He described you right down to the jacket. Gerald tapped the counter once. The seat's yours if you want it. Saffron's pulse quickened. She looked over her shoulder at the waiting area, scanning faces, searching for anyone who might be watching her. The woman hadn't moved. The man in the military jacket turned a page in his book. The college students were laughing about something on a phone screen. Nobody was paying attention to her. "Who bought this?" she asked, turning back to Gerald. "Couldn't tell you. Cash transaction. No ID required on the purchaser's end. He came in around noon, bought the ticket, left the envelope and walked out." Gerald pushed the ticket an inch closer to her. "Bus boards in 40 minutes. Gate 6. Saffron picked up the ticket and held it like it might dissolve in her hands. First class, paid in cash, under a name she had never heard before, attached to a face that only one person in the world had reason to track across state lines. Her mouth went dry. She thought about putting the ticket down and walking out. She thought about heading back into the street and finding another way south on her own terms, under her own power, without accepting anything from whoever was pulling these strings. Then she thought about the 52 cents in her pocket, and the blister on her heel, and the fact that she hadn't eaten in almost 20 hours and had nowhere to sleep tonight. She walked to Gate 6. The bus was a newer model, clean and quiet, with wide reclining seats in the first-class section. Saffron found her assigned seat, window, row 3, and sat down. The leather was cool against her back. She buckled her seatbelt and leaned her forehead against the glass. As other passengers filed on, she noticed something strange.
The seat beside her stayed empty. So did the seat across the aisle, and the seat behind her, and the seat in front of her. The entire first-class section filled up everywhere except the 4 seats immediately surrounding hers, creating a pocket of empty space with Saffron at its center. The bus pulled out of the depot at 11 sharp. Newark's lights slid past the window and faded into the dark stretch of the turnpike, and Saffron sat in her little island of silence, watching the road disappear beneath her. Someone had bought her a ticket before she even knew she was coming here. Someone had described her jacket to a stranger. Someone had given her a new name and made sure nobody would sit close enough to bother her. She pressed her palm flat against the cold window and closed her eyes. The bus carried her south through the dark, and somewhere behind her, a city full of answers kept getting farther away. The bus pulled into Philadelphia's Greyhound terminal at 4:15 in the morning. Saffron stepped off into the cold and stood on the platform while the other passengers shuffled past her toward the exit, dragging luggage and rubbing sleep from their eyes. She had slept for maybe 2 hours on the bus, broken into fragments by the rumble of the engine and the occasional flash of headlights from passing trucks. Each time she woke, she checked the empty seats around her, half expecting to find someone sitting there. They stayed vacant the entire ride. Philadelphia greeted her with a sharp wind that cut through her jacket, and a sky the color of wet cement. The terminal was small and mostly empty at this hour, staffed by a single attendant behind a coffee stand who was scrolling through his phone with the energy of someone counting down the minutes until his shift ended. Saffron used the restroom to wash her face and hands with the thin pink soap from the dispenser. She looked at herself in the mirror under the harsh overhead light. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hair had come loose from its clip on one side, and the collar of her blouse was wrinkled from sleeping at an angle. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been awake for most of 2 days and had no idea where she was going. She dried her face with a paper towel and walked out into the city. The streets around the terminal were quiet. A few delivery trucks rumbled past on Market Street. A jogger crossed an intersection 2 blocks ahead. Saffron walked east without a destination, letting the movement keep her warm while she tried to organize her thinking. The ticket had changed things. Back in New York, she could almost convince herself that Derek Malone had simply let her go. A clean cut. Walk away, keep your mouth shut, and everybody moves on. That story made sense for about 36 hours.
The ticket shattered it. Someone was watching her. Someone who knew where she was going before she did, who had resources to buy out seats on a bus and plant a prepaid ticket under a name she'd never used. That took money, access and planning. That took people on the ground in multiple locations, coordinated in advance. She should have been terrified. Part of her was, but another part, the same part that had followed the numbers through 4 layers of shell accounts instead of closing the laptop, was doing math. If someone wanted to hurt her, a bus ticket to Philadelphia was an odd way to go about it. You don't buy a woman first-class passage and cushion her in empty seats if the plan is to make her disappear, which meant the plan was something else. That thought scared her almost more than the alternative. By 7:30, the city had woken up around her. Traffic thickened. Storefronts opened. The smell of fresh bread drifted out of a bakery on Chestnut Street and nearly stopped her in her tracks. Her stomach clenched hard enough to make her wince. She kept walking. She needed a phone.
Somewhere she could make a call, reach her sister, explain the situation without sounding completely out of her mind. Her sister Nadia was practical and sharp and lived in Richmond with her husband, and she would wire money or come get her if Saffron could just find a way to reach her. The hotel appeared on the corner of a cobblestone side street in the historic district, 4 stories of red brick and white trim with black shutters and a polished brass door handle. A small sign mounted beside the entrance read, "The Bellamy, Est, 1887. It looked like the kind of place that served tea in china cups and charged $400 a night for the smallest room. Saffron pushed through the door and stepped into a lobby that smelled like fresh flowers and furniture polish. Dark wood paneling, a crystal chandelier, a patterned rug so thick her shoes sank into it. Behind the front desk stood a woman in her 40s with auburn hair pinned neatly at her neck and a name tag that read, Catherine. "Good morning," Saffron said, trying to sound like someone who belonged in a lobby like this. "I'm sorry to bother you. I've had my phone stolen, and I was wondering if I could use your house phone to make a quick call. I can pay for—" "Ms. Ellison?" Saffron's mouth stayed open, but no words came out. Catherine smiled warmly. "We've been expecting you. I hope your trip wasn't too exhausting." She reached below the counter and produced a slim key card in a paper sleeve. "You're in suite 412, 4th floor, end of the hall. The elevator is just past the sitting room on your left." Saffron took the key card without thinking, her fingers closing around it on instinct. The name on the sleeve read, M. Ellison, extended stay. "There must be a mistake," she heard herself say. "No mistake at all." Catherine's tone was pleasant and rehearsed, the voice of someone delivering a speech she had memorized. "Your accommodations are fully arranged. Dining is available around the clock through room service. Just dial 9 from the suite phone. If you need anything at all, my extension is at the desk." Saffron stood frozen in the lobby, holding the key card, while a bellhop she hadn't noticed before gestured politely toward the elevator. She rode up to the 4th floor in silence. Suite 412 was larger than her apartment back in New York. A king bed with white linens pulled tight enough to bounce a coin off. A sitting area with 2 upholstered chairs and a writing desk near the window. A bathroom with a marble vanity and a glass shower, and towels so thick they looked like they'd never been used. On the bed, laid out with careful precision, were clothes, a charcoal wool coat, a pair of dark jeans in her exact size, 2 blouses, one white, one navy, still pinned with tissue paper, a pair of leather boots that she already knew would fit before she picked them up, undergarments, still in packaging, correct in every measurement. Saffron set down the boots and pressed her hand over her mouth. Someone knew her sizes. All of them. She turned slowly toward the vanity table by the window. A small black velvet box sat at its center, positioned directly in a beam of morning light coming through the curtains. No note. No card. No name. She opened it.
Inside, resting on a cushion of white silk, was a ring, a single emerald, flanked by 2 small diamonds on a gold band, delicate and precise, and absolutely meant for her. Saffron closed the box and set it back on the vanity. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a very long time. Outside the window, Philadelphia moved through its morning. Cars honking, people walking, church bells ringing somewhere in the distance. Inside Suite 412, a woman who had started this week with a steady job and a normal life sat surrounded by clothes that fit her perfectly and a ring she hadn't asked for, trying to understand the shape of the invisible hand that kept reaching for her. She picked up the suite phone and dialed room service.
"Could I get breakfast, please?" she said quietly. "Anything, whatever you have." She hung up and looked at the velvet box one more time. Then she pulled the curtains shut. Saffron left Philadelphia before dawn. She had slept for 10 hours straight in that hotel bed, the deepest sleep she'd had in years, and woke up angry about it. Angry at how good the sheets felt. Angry at how perfectly the boots fit when she laced them up. Angry at the way the charcoal coat sat on her shoulders like it had been tailored in the room while she slept. She left the velvet box on the vanity table. She took the clothes because she had nothing else to wear, and her old blouse smelled like 2 days of walking. She took the coat because it was 40 degrees outside, and pride wouldn't keep her warm. But the ring stayed behind. Whoever was doing this needed to understand that she could be practical without being bought. The train to Baltimore cost nothing. She discovered this when she approached the Amtrak counter at 30th Street Station and gave the name Mara Ellison, half expecting and half dreading what would happen. The attendant printed a ticket without asking for payment or identification. A regional seat, not first class this time, which almost made her feel better until she realized that the restraint was probably deliberate. Whoever was arranging things had noticed she was uncomfortable with luxury and dialed it back just enough to keep her moving. That thought stayed with her for the entire 90-minute ride south. She had a plan now, a real one. During those 10 hours of sleep, somewhere between the exhaustion and the crisp white pillows, her subconscious had done the work her waking mind couldn't. She needed help from someone she trusted, someone outside whatever web Derek Malone was weaving around her. And there was exactly one person who fit that description: Leonard Price. Leonard had been her mentor during a summer internship 4 years ago at a private security consulting firm in Baltimore. He was 63, ex-military intelligence, built like a filing cabinet, and had the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled until you said something genuinely funny, and then his whole expression cracked open like sunlight through a door. He had taught Saffron more about forensic accounting in 3 months than her entire graduate program had managed in 2 years. More importantly, he had taught her how to recognize when numbers were lying and when to walk away from the table. She hadn't walked away from Derek's table fast enough, but Leonard would know what to do. He always did. The train pulled into Penn Station, Baltimore at 8:30. Saffron stepped onto the platform and breathed in air that tasted different from New York and Philadelphia, something metallic and coastal, mixed with the exhaust from the idling trains. She walked through the station and out onto Charles Street, where the morning traffic was already building and the sidewalks were filling with people in office clothes, carrying coffee cups and moving with the automatic rhythm of daily routine. Leonard's firm occupied the 3rd floor of a narrow stone building on Pratt Street, 6 blocks from the inner harbor. The building was old but well-maintained, wedged between a law office and a print shop, with a brass directory plate in the lobby listing 4 tenants. Saffron had visited this office twice during her internship and once after, when Leonard invited her to lunch on a trip through the city. She remembered the creaky elevator, the frosted glass door with his company name etched in black letters, and the perpetual smell of strong coffee that seeped into the hallway. She found the building and pushed through the front door. The lobby was quiet. The elevator was still creaky. She rode it to the 3rd floor and stepped into the hallway.
The frosted glass door was dark. Saffron tried the handle. Locked. She cupped her hands against the glass and peered inside. The office was empty. The desks were cleared. The bookshelves that Leonard kept stuffed with intelligence manuals and old case files were bare. Even the coffee machine, a massive stainless steel contraption he treated with more affection than most people showed their pets, was gone. A printed notice was taped to the inside of the glass. Saffron read it twice to make sure she understood. Price Consulting Group has permanently closed effective October 1st. All client inquiries should be directed to the forwarding address below. October 1st. 5 days ago. The same week Saffron had started working at the warehouse. She stepped back from the door and stared at the empty office through the glass. Leonard Price had run this firm for 11 years. He had a client list that stretched across 3 states and a reputation built on decades of field experience. Men like Leonard didn't close up shop in the middle of a fiscal quarter and vanish. They retired slowly, handing off clients one at a time, throwing a dinner, making a speech. They didn't tape a notice to a dark door and disappear. Unless someone made it worth their while to leave quickly. Saffron walked downstairs and found the building manager in a small office behind the lobby. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a sandwich sitting untouched on his desk. "Excuse me, the consulting firm on the 3rd floor, Price Consulting. Do you know where Mr. Price went?" The manager looked at her over his glasses. "Retired, gave his 30-day notice, paid out the lease in full, and left the office spotless. Said he was moving overseas. Portugal, I think. Maybe Spain. Somewhere warm." He shrugged. "Nice man. Always paid on time." "Did he seem like he was in a hurry?" "Everyone's in a hurry these days." Saffron thanked him and walked back outside. She stood on the sidewalk with her hands in the pockets of her new coat and watched the traffic pass on Pratt Street. The harbour glinted at the end of the block, grey-blue under a cloudy sky. Leonard was gone. Paid out. Relocated. Sent somewhere warm and distant, where a 26-year-old former student with too many questions couldn't reach him. The timing was surgical, the execution was clean, and the message was unmistakable. Every door she might turn to was being quietly closed before she could reach it. She tried to feel outraged. She tried to summon the fury that should come with realizing that someone was dismantling her safety net piece by piece, removing every anchor she had in the world. And part of her did feel that, a hot wire of anger running just beneath her ribs. But underneath the anger was something else, something she didn't want to name, because naming it would mean admitting that it was real. Whoever was doing this wasn't cutting her off. They were funneling her. Gently, expensively, and with terrifying precision. They were closing every exit until only one path remained. And that path led back to Derek Malone. Saffron started walking toward the harbour. She needed to sit somewhere open and think, somewhere with enough sky above her to keep the walls from feeling like they were closing in. She didn't notice the silver sedan parked 2 blocks behind her, pull away from the curb and follow at a distance, matching her pace, step for step. The inner harbour at night was a different city. During the day, it was tourists and families, and office workers, eating lunch on benches with their faces turned toward the water. At night, the crowds thinned out, and the promenade took on a quieter character. Joggers finishing late runs, couples walking slowly along the waterfront, a few street musicians packing up their instruments as the temperature dropped. The harbour itself was black and still, broken only by the reflected glow of the buildings ringing its edge and the occasional ripple from a passing water taxi. Saffron sat on a wooden bench near the water's edge, the collar of her charcoal coat turned up against the wind.
She had been sitting for almost 2 hours, watching the city's reflection shimmer on the surface and trying to make sense of the last 5 days of her life. The facts, laid out in order, painted a picture she couldn't quite bring into focus. Derek Malone had stripped her of everything she owned and sent her into the night with empty pockets. Within 24 hours, someone began tracking her movements with enough precision to plant a bus ticket before she arrived and book a hotel suite under a name she'd never heard. Her clothes were replaced, her travel was arranged, and the one person she trusted enough to ask for help had been paid to leave the country before she could reach him. Each move on its own could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern that made her chest tight every time she looked at it directly. She pulled her knees up on the bench and wrapped her arms around them. The wind came off the water in cold gusts that smelled like salt and diesel. Somewhere behind her, a street musician played the last few bars of something slow on a saxophone, the notes drifting across the promenade and dissolving into the dark. She needed to decide. Stay in Baltimore and try to rebuild some kind of footing on her own, or keep moving south and see what was waiting for her at the next stop. Both options felt like choosing between doors in a house that someone else had built. She was so deep inside her own thoughts that she didn't notice the men. There were 4 of them. They had entered the promenade from 2 different directions, 2 from the parking structure to the north, 2 from the pedestrian bridge to the east. They wore dark, casual clothing, the kind designed to blend into a nighttime crowd without drawing attention. Each one moved at a slightly different pace, taking slightly different paths, but all 4 were converging on the same point, the bench where Saffron was sitting. They were professionals. Their spacing was deliberate, their sightlines coordinated so that each man could see at least one other team member at all times. The tallest of the 4 carried a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in short, clipped sentences. The one closest to Saffron, approaching from the east walkway, maybe 60 yards out, had his right hand in his jacket pocket and his eyes locked on her back. These were not Derek's men. These were recovery agents contracted by the Hargrove faction, the same rogue board members whose operatives had been turned away at Grand Central 3 days earlier. They had picked up Saffron's trail somewhere between Philadelphia and Baltimore, and they had spent the last several hours positioning themselves for a clean extraction. No witnesses, no commotion, no trace. Just a woman on a bench who would stand up, walk to a waiting vehicle, and never be seen again. The agent from the east walkway was 40 yards out when the first shadow appeared. He came from behind the Marine Museum, moving along the tree line with the kind of fluid, unhurried stride that only people with extensive tactical training can maintain while closing distance fast. A second figure emerged from the stairwell near the parking structure, positioning himself directly in the path of the 2 northern agents. A third stepped out of a parked vehicle on the access road, and a 4th materialized near the pedestrian bridge, sealing the eastern approach. Derek's personal security unit. 4 men, matching the recovery team number for number, already in position before the Hargrove agents had completed their approach. The intercept happened in silence. The agent from the east walkway was the first to realize something had changed. He slowed his pace when he saw the figure standing in his path, a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat, hands visible, feet planted, making no aggressive move, but occupying the space in a way that communicated everything without a word. The agent stopped. He looked to his left for his partner near the bridge and found another figure standing in that lane. Same posture, same calm authority. To the north, the 2 remaining Hargrove agents found their route similarly blocked. The man near the parking structure stood with his back to the harbor light, his silhouette large enough to fill the walkway. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He simply stood there, and the 2 agents approaching him understood what they were looking at. They were outpositioned. Every angle they had planned to use was already occupied. Every route to the bench was sealed, and the men blocking their paths carried themselves with the specific kind of stillness that said this situation had only one outcome, and it had already been decided. 12 seconds passed. The tallest Hargrove agent lowered his phone. He said something to his partner. Both northern agents turned and walked back toward the parking structure at a measured pace. The Eastern agent held his position for another 3 seconds, staring at the man in front of him, then broke eye contact and retreated toward the pedestrian bridge. His partner followed. All 4 were gone within 90 seconds. They didn't run. They didn't make a sound. They simply dissolved back into the night like they had never been there. Derek's team held their positions for another 5 minutes, watching the exit points, confirming the retreat. Then they too faded back, to vehicles, to shadows, to wherever they waited when they weren't standing between Saffron and the people who wanted to take her. On the bench, Saffron lifted her head. She had noticed a momentary pause in the foot traffic around her, a few seconds where the promenade seemed to hold its breath, where the joggers and couples seemed to thin out and the air carried a different weight. She looked around, scanning the walkways in both directions. A couple was strolling near the museum. A man was walking a small dog along the railing. A jogger passed under a streetlight and disappeared around the curve. Nothing out of place. Nothing unusual. She rubbed her arms and checked the time on the clock tower across the harbor. Almost 11. She needed to find somewhere to sleep, or start walking, or make some kind of decision about what tomorrow looked like. She stood up from the bench, stretched her shoulders, and started walking south along the promenade toward the lights of Federal Hill. Behind her, the bench sat empty under the yellow glow of a street lamp. The water lapped against the harbor wall, and the 4 men who had just kept her from vanishing into somebody else's custody watched from a distance until she rounded the corner and passed out of sight, safe for another night in a city that had almost swallowed her whole. Washington, D.C. arrived under a gray sky that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single break in the clouds. Saffron had caught a regional train out of Baltimore early that morning, using the name Mara Ellison at the ticket window and receiving the same smooth, prepaid experience she was beginning to expect. The attendant didn't blink. The ticket was already in the system. The seat was reserved. She climbed aboard and rode south in silence, watching Maryland's landscape slide past the window. Suburbs giving way to farmland, giving way to suburbs again, while she turned the same questions over in her mind like stones in a tumbler. She had chosen D.C. for one reason: size. The city was massive, dense, and filled with enough people and institutions and competing interests that a single woman without identification could disappear into its fabric and stay hidden long enough to build a new foundation. She could find work off the books. She could rent a room in a shared house. She could become invisible the old-fashioned way, through anonymity and patience, and eventually piece together enough documentation to start over. That was the theory. Union Station swallowed her whole when she stepped off the train. The building was enormous. Arched ceilings, marble columns, crowds moving in every direction with the focused energy of a city that ran on schedules and agendas. Saffron moved through the main hall with her head down and her hands in the pockets of the charcoal coat, navigating by instinct toward the Massachusetts Avenue exit. She would walk east into one of the residential neighborhoods, find a library with public computers, and start looking for room listings and cash-paying jobs. Step by step, brick by brick. She pushed through the glass doors onto the sidewalk and stopped. A black sedan was parked directly in front of the exit. It was polished to the point where the overcast sky reflected off its hood like a mirror, and it sat in a loading zone with its engine running, a thin ribbon of exhaust curling from the tailpipe into the cold morning air. Standing beside the rear passenger door was a man she recognized. He was the tallest of the 4 who had been in Derek's office on the night everything started, the one Derek had spoken to when he gave the order to escort her out. He stood with his hands folded in front of him, wearing a dark suit and a long overcoat, and he was looking directly at her. Saffron's feet stopped moving before her brain caught up. Every muscle in her body tightened. She glanced left, then right, calculating the distance to the nearest cross street, the nearest crowd, the nearest open door she could duck through. "Ms. Ellison."
His voice was deep and measured, carrying across the sidewalk without effort. "My name is Marcus. We met briefly in New York." "I remember," Saffron said. Her voice was steady, though her pulse was hammering against the inside of her wrists. "You walked me out of the building." Marcus inclined his head. "I did." "And now you're here." "I am." Saffron stayed where she was, 10 feet from the sedan, feet planted on the concrete. Commuters streamed past her on both sides, splitting around the two of them like water around rocks. "What happens if I walk away right now?" she asked. Marcus considered the question. "Then I stand here until you're out of sight, I get back in this car, and I follow at a distance to make sure you arrive wherever you're going safely, same as I've been doing since New York." The honesty of it hit her like cold water. She had suspected she was being followed. She had assumed there were eyes on her, somewhere in the background, tracking her route. But hearing it confirmed, hearing this man say it out loud with the calm clarity of someone describing his commute, was something else entirely. "You've been behind me this whole time?" she said. "Grand Central, Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore?" "Yes, ma'am." "The bus ticket, the hotel, the train tickets?" "Arranged on Mr. Malone's instructions." Saffron exhaled through her nose. The air came out in a thin cloud that dissolved immediately. She looked at the sedan, at the tinted windows that showed nothing of the interior, at the clean black paint and the chrome door handle that Marcus was standing beside with the patience of a man who would wait all day if necessary. "What's in the car?" she asked. Marcus reached into his coat and produced a leather portfolio, dark brown, about the size of a legal folder. He held it out to her. "This." Saffron crossed the 10 feet between them and took the portfolio. It was heavier than she expected. She unzipped it and looked inside. The first page was a printed summary bearing the header of a private legal firm she didn't recognize. She read the opening paragraph, then read it again, slower. Her name, her real name, Saffron Cole, had been removed from every corporate database connected to Atlantic Crown Freight Solutions. Every personnel record, every access log, every digital signature she had left during her 3 weeks of contract work had been scrubbed.
Her tax filings related to the position had been rerouted through a holding company that no longer existed. Her biometric data from the building security system had been overwritten. The second page was a new identity package, Mara Ellison, complete with a social security number, a credit history going back 6 years, employment records at 3 legitimate firms, and a clean background check. It was thorough enough to pass any standard verification process in the country. The third page was a single paragraph, typed on plain white paper with no letterhead. "You are untraceable. No one from my organization or any connected entity can locate you through conventional channels. The identity you hold is yours permanently. What you do with it is your decision." It was unsigned. Saffron closed the portfolio and held it against her chest. She stared at the sedan for a long moment. The engine idled. Marcus waited. "Where does this car go?" she asked. "South. There's a residence waiting for you on the coast. Private, secure, fully staffed. You'll have complete freedom of the property and the surrounding area." "And if I say no?" Marcus met her eyes. "Then I wish you well, Ms. Ellison, and I remain in this city until Mr. Malone tells me otherwise." Saffron looked down at the portfolio in her arms. 6 days ago, she had stood in a warehouse office and handed over everything she owned to a man she barely knew. Since then, that same man had fed her, clothed her, sheltered her, moved her across 4 states, erased her from every system that could endanger her, and built her an entirely new life on paper. She had been running from him for almost a week, and every single step of her escape had been designed by him. She opened the rear door herself before Marcus could reach for it. "Let's go," she said. She climbed inside, set the portfolio on the seat beside her, and pulled the door shut. The sedan pulled away from Union Station and merged into the flow of DC traffic, heading south. Saffron watched the Capitol dome shrink in the rear window and disappear behind the trees. She was done running from answers. The drive took 5 hours. Marcus didn't speak unless Saffron spoke first, and she appreciated that more than she could express. She spent the first hour staring out the window, watching Virginia's highways unfold in long gray ribbons through pine forests and small towns with gas stations and church steeples. She spent the second hour reading through the portfolio again, slower this time, absorbing every detail of the identity that had been built for her. By the third hour, she had fallen asleep with her forehead against the glass, and when she woke up somewhere past the North Carolina border, the landscape had changed. The trees were different here, taller, thinner, bending slightly in a wind that carried the faint taste of salt even through the sealed windows of the sedan. The sky had opened up from DC's heavy gray into something wider and paler, and the light had a quality she couldn't describe, softer, like it was being filtered through something clean. They crossed a long bridge over a body of water that stretched in both directions until it dissolved into the horizon. Saffron pressed her hand against the window and watched the water move beneath them, silver blue and restless. "Outer Banks," Marcus said from the driver's seat. It was the first word he'd spoken in 3 hours. The road narrowed after the bridge, 2 lanes, flat, bordered by seagrass and low dunes that blocked any view of the ocean but couldn't hide its sound. Saffron could hear the waves even through the car, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate through the road itself. Marcus turned off the main road onto a private drive marked by a simple wooden post with no sign or number. The drive wound through a stand of live oaks draped in Spanish moss, their branches arching overhead to form a tunnel of green and gray. It went on for almost a quarter mile before the trees opened up and the house appeared. It wasn't a house. That word was too small for what she was looking at. The estate sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, built from weathered gray shingle and white trim in a style that looked like it had grown out of the coastline rather than been placed on top of it. Wide porches wrapped around 3 sides. Floor-to-ceiling windows caught the afternoon light and threw it back in sheets of gold. A stone pathway led from the circular drive through a garden of coastal grasses and wildflowers to a front door made of dark, reclaimed wood. Marcus parked the sedan and opened her door. The wind hit her immediately, warm for October, carrying salt and the green smell of the seagrass and something floral she couldn't identify. The sound of the ocean was enormous here, a constant presence that filled every gap in the air. Saffron stepped out and stood in the driveway, staring at the house. "This is mine?" she asked. The question came out before she could frame it better. "This is yours for as long as you choose to stay," Marcus said. "The property is fully staffed. Housekeeper, chef, groundskeeper. You have access to everything on the estate and the surrounding beaches. There's a car in the garage with keys in the kitchen drawer if you want to drive into town." He handed her a simple brass key. "Front door. The staff knows you as Ms. Ellison. They've been told you're a private client of Mr. Malone's firm and that your privacy is the highest priority." Saffron took the key and closed her fingers around it. The metal was warm from Marcus's pocket. "Will you be staying?" she asked. "I'll be on the property. Guest house near the north gate. You won't see me unless you need to." He paused, and for the first time since she'd met him, something close to warmth crossed his face. "Get some rest, Miss Ellison. You've earned it." He walked back to the sedan, drove it around the side of the house, and was gone. Saffron stood alone in the driveway for a full minute, listening to the ocean. Then she walked up the stone path and unlocked the front door. The interior was everything the exterior promised. Hardwood floors the color of honey, linen furniture in shades of white and pale blue, a stone fireplace tall enough to stand in, bookshelves lining an entire wall of the main living room filled with real books, old ones with cracked spines and cloth covers. The kitchen was open and bright, with a wide island and windows that looked out over the dunes to the water. She walked through every room. 3 bedrooms upstairs, each with its own bathroom, a study with a desk and a leather chair and a view of the garden, a screened porch off the back of the house where you could sit and watch the ocean without the wind pulling at your clothes. In the master bedroom, the bed was made with the same crisp precision as the hotel in Philadelphia. Fresh flowers sat on the nightstand. A closet held a full wardrobe in her sizes, casual this time, linen pants and cotton shirts, and a few simple dresses in colors that would look right against sand and water. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against the mattress. The house was silent, except for the waves. A knock came from downstairs at 4 o'clock. Saffron opened the front door to find a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and kind eyes standing beside a man in a tan suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Miss Ellison, I'm Grace, the housekeeper, and this is Mr. Alderman. He's a legal representative. He asked if you might have a few minutes to speak." Saffron let them in. Grace disappeared into the kitchen and returned 5 minutes later with tea and shortbread on a tray, then excused herself. Mr. Alderman sat across from Saffron in the living room, opened his briefcase, and laid out a series of documents on the coffee table. "I'll keep this straightforward," he said.
I've been retained to inform you of several actions taken on your behalf over the past week. He walked her through it, document by document. Her student loans, $43,000, had been paid in full. Her apartment lease in New York had been terminated cleanly, her security deposit returned, and her personal belongings packed and placed in secure storage. An outstanding medical bill from a procedure 2 years ago had been settled. A credit card balance she'd been carrying for 8 months was zeroed out. Every financial obligation tied to the name Saffron Cole had been dissolved. Quietly, completely, and without her knowledge or consent. Mr. Alderman closed his briefcase. "You have no debts, no active contracts, and no pending obligations under either your former or current identity. You are, in every legal and financial sense, free." He stood, shook her hand, and left. Saffron sat in the living room with the documents spread across the table and the sound of the ocean filling the house. She picked up her tea and held it with both hands, the way she'd held that $1 cup of coffee in the diner at Grand Central a lifetime ago. 5 days, 5 states. Every thread connecting her to her old life had been cut. The debts, the records, the name itself. And every cut had been made with the same precise, invisible hand that had taken her phone and her badge in that warehouse office and told her to go. The man who had sent her into the cold with nothing had spent every moment since then making sure she would never need anything again. Saffron set down the tea and looked out at the ocean. The sun was dropping toward the waterline, turning the sky into bands of copper and rose. She thought about the ring she had left behind in Philadelphia, sitting on that vanity table in its velvet box. She thought about the unsigned note in her portfolio. She thought about a man she had spoken to for less than 3 minutes, who had somehow understood her well enough to know her clothing sizes and her student loan balance and the name of a mentor she hadn't mentioned to anyone in years. She was afraid. She was grateful. And underneath both of those, in a place she was only now allowing herself to look, she was curious about the man behind all of it. For the first time in 6 days, she stopped running.
1,200 miles north, Derek Malone was finishing a war. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Crown Atlantic Tower in Manhattan had no windows. This was by design. The room was built for conversations that required absolute privacy. Soundproofed walls, signal-blocking technology embedded in the ceiling panels, and a single door controlled by a biometric lock that responded to exactly 5 fingerprints in the world. The long table at its center seated 14, and tonight every chair was occupied. Derek sat at the head. He wore a black suit with no tie, his jacket unbuttoned, his hands resting on the arms of his chair with the stillness of a man who had already decided how this evening would end. He had been in this building for 16 hours, arriving before dawn and working through the day without eating, pausing only twice, once to take a secure call from Marcus confirming Saffron's safe arrival at the coastal estate, and once to stand at the window of his private office and watch the sun set over the Hudson while he made a decision he couldn't walk back from. The decision was made. He was here to deliver it. Seated to his left were 4 men who had been with him since the beginning, his inner circle, loyal, tested, bound to him through years of shared risk and mutual trust. They sat with the quiet confidence of men who already knew the outcome and were simply waiting for the room to catch up. To his right, spread across the remaining seats, sat the board. 8 men in expensive suits with expensive watches and the particular brand of controlled nervousness that comes from knowing you've overplayed your hand.
The Hargrove faction. Raymond Hargrove himself sat in the center of the group, a lean man in his 60s, with silver hair combed straight back and eyes that never quite settled on one spot. He had joined the organization's board 12 years ago, back when Derek's father was still running operations, and had spent the years since building his own network of loyalties and influence within the structure. He was smart, patient, and dangerously ambitious. The kind of man who never challenged you directly, but was always positioning pieces for a move 3 turns away. His move had come last week. While Derek was dealing with the situation at the waterfront warehouse, Hargrove had quietly activated a clause in the organization's charter that allowed the board to vote on leadership succession if a majority determined that the current head had compromised operational security. The argument was simple. Derek had allowed a contract auditor to access the real ledgers, which constituted a breach severe enough to trigger a leadership challenge. It was a good play. Clean, procedural, almost elegant in its timing. Hargrove had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening, and the moment Saffron Cole sat down at that terminal and pulled up the second set of books, he had his ammunition. What Hargrove didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Derek had seen it coming before it started. The auditor position had been Hargrove's suggestion. He had pushed for an outside contractor to review the quarterly filings, arguing that it would satisfy regulatory appearance requirements. Derek had agreed, because agreeing allowed him to watch exactly which files Hargrove's people directed the auditor toward, and that told him everything he needed to know about where Hargrove's loyalty actually pointed. Saffron was supposed to be a tool. Hargrove's people had subtly ensured she would find the second ledger, planning to use her discovery as the basis for their challenge. What nobody anticipated was that Saffron would copy the files herself before Hargrove's team could control the narrative, which forced Derek to move faster than he'd planned and pull her out before she became a liability for both sides. Sending her away with nothing wasn't cruelty. It was the fastest way to make her invisible to a faction that was already preparing to use her as evidence, or worse, as a loose end that needed permanent handling. Derek had spent the 6 days since then doing 2 things simultaneously: protecting Saffron across 5 states and dismantling Hargrove's position piece by piece from the inside. Tonight was the final piece. "Raymond," Derek said. His voice carried the length of the table without effort. Let's save everyone the trouble of pretending this is a discussion. Hargrove's jaw tightened, but his expression held. Derek opened a slim folder in front of him and slid it down the table. It traveled the polished surface and stopped in front of Hargrove's hands. Inside that folder, you'll find documentation of 14 unauthorized transfers made from syndicate operational accounts into private holdings controlled by members of your faction over the past 3 years. Total value, just under 90 million. Every transaction is traced, time-stamped, and verified through independent forensic audit. The room went silent. 2 of the men sitting with Hargrove exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation. Derek continued. You'll also find records of the recovery team you dispatched to Baltimore 4 days ago to detain a civilian under my personal protection. The team was contracted through a third-party firm in Virginia that traces back to a shell company registered in your wife's maiden name. Hargrove opened the folder. He read the first page. His face didn't change, but his hands did. A slight tremor at the fingertips, barely visible, lasting only a second before he pressed his palms flat against the table.
Here's what happens now, Derek said. Every member of this faction resigns their board position effective immediately. All operational claims, territorial rights, and financial authorities revert to Central Command. Your private holdings will be audited over the next 60 days, and any funds traced to syndicate accounts will be returned in full. And if we decline? Hargrove's voice was steady, but the question itself was a concession. Men who hold power don't ask what happens if they refuse. They refuse. There is no decline, Raymond. The charter you tried to use against me requires a majority board vote. As of this morning, 6 of your 8 supporters have already signed transfer of authority agreements. I have them in my office. Derek paused. You're not being voted out. You've already been voted out. This meeting is a courtesy. Hargrove looked down the table at the men seated beside him. 2 of them were staring at the table. 3 others wouldn't meet his eyes. The remaining one, the youngest of the group, a man named Talbot, who had been Hargrove's closest ally, cleared his throat, pushed back his chair, and stood. I signed this morning, Talbot said quietly. I'm sorry, Raymond. He walked out. The room held its silence for a long time after the door closed. Hargrove sat perfectly still, staring at the folder in front of him. Then he closed it, placed both hands flat on the table, and looked at Derek. Your father would have handled this differently. My father isn't here. Hargrove stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without another word. The remaining board members followed one by one, each passing Derek's chair without speaking, until the room was empty except for Derek and his 4 men. The silence that followed was total. Derek's second-in-command, a stocky man named Ellis, who had been with him for 15 years, leaned back in his chair and exhaled. That's done. Derek closed his folder. Get the plane ready. I'm flying to North Carolina tonight. Ellis nodded and pulled out his phone. Derek sat alone at the head of the empty table. The building hummed around him, the mechanical pulse of climate systems and elevator shafts and the invisible infrastructure that kept a tower like this standing. He thought about the woman on the coast, sitting in a house he had chosen for her, surrounded by the freedom he had built around her without her knowledge. He had removed every threat, dismantled every faction, cleared every obstacle between her and safety. The empire was his, undivided and absolute. Now came the part he couldn't control. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the conference room toward a woman who had every reason to hate him and no obligation to listen to a single word he had to say. Saffron found the library on her second evening at the estate. It occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor, behind a set of double doors she had assumed led to a storage room during her initial walkthrough. When she finally pushed them open, she stood in the doorway for a full minute, just looking. The room was 2 stories tall, with a mezzanine level accessible by a spiral staircase in the corner.
Every wall was shelved floor to ceiling, and every shelf was filled. The books were old and real, leather spines in shades of brown and burgundy and forest green, gold lettering faded by decades of salt air and handling. A stone fireplace anchored the far wall, flanked by 2 armchairs upholstered in worn oxblood leather. A reading table sat near the window, its surface bare except for a brass lamp with a green glass shade. The window looked out over the ocean. Saffron had spent the past 2 days in this room. She read for hours at a time, pulling books at random, a collection of maritime maps, a biography of a jazz musician she'd never heard of, a water-stained copy of a novel about a woman who sailed alone across the Pacific.
She ate her meals in the armchair by the fireplace, plates balanced on the wide leather arm, while Grace clucked disapprovingly about crumbs and upholstery. Reading kept her mind occupied. It gave her something to focus on besides the questions that circled her thoughts every time she sat still for too long. Questions about Derek Malone, about why a man with his resources and his power would spend this kind of effort on a contract auditor who had stumbled into his books by accident, about what the ring in Philadelphia meant, and the unsigned note in the portfolio, and the fact that every piece of this elaborate architecture pointed toward a conclusion she wasn't ready to examine. On the evening of her second day, she was curled in the armchair with the sailing novel and a cup of tea when she heard the front door open. Footsteps crossed the hardwood in the foyer. Not Grace's. Grace wore soft shoes that barely registered on the floor. These were heavier, measured, spaced with the deliberate rhythm of someone who never rushed. They paused in the hallway. Then they moved toward the library. The double doors opened, and Derek Malone walked in. He looked different from the man in the warehouse. The black suit was gone, replaced by a dark navy sweater and gray trousers. His sleeves were pushed to his forearms. He was carrying a leather folder in one hand, and he moved into the room the way he seemed to move through everything, with the quiet certainty of a man who had already measured every dimension of the space before entering it. He saw her in the armchair and stopped a few feet inside the door. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. The ocean murmured outside the window. The brass lamp cast a warm circle of light that reached just far enough to touch the edge of his shoes. "You're in my chair," he said. Saffron closed her book. "You're in my house." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close enough to change the geometry of his face in a way she hadn't expected. He looked younger when he wasn't behind that desk, more human. He pulled the second armchair around to face hers and sat down. The leather creaked under his weight. He set the folder on his knee and rested his hands on top of it. And then he waited. Saffron studied him. She had imagined this conversation a dozen times over the past 2 days, rehearsing what she would say, how she would say it, what tone she would use. She had prepared arguments and accusations and demands for explanations. She had practiced being cold, being angry, being the kind of composed and untouchable that a man like this would respect. All of that preparation evaporated the moment she opened her mouth. "You had no right," she said. Her voice was quieter than she intended. "None of this. The tickets, the hotel, the clothes, Leonard, my apartment, my entire identity. You had no right to do any of it. You made every decision about my life for the last 10 days without asking me a single question. You moved me across 5 states like a package. You erased who I was and replaced me with someone who doesn't exist. And you did all of it from 1,000 miles away without ever once picking up a phone and telling me why." Derek listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change while she spoke. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the fire and the distant rhythm of waves against the bluff. "You're right," he said, "about the method. I made those decisions without your input because your input would have required contact, and contact would have made you visible to people who were actively trying to find you." "What people?" "Members of my board, a faction led by a man named Raymond Hargrove. They planted you in my organization, Saffron. The auditing contract, the access to the files, they arranged it.
You were meant to find the second ledger. They planned to use your discovery to trigger a leadership challenge against me, and once that process started, you would have become a liability they needed to eliminate. Saffron's hands went still in her lap. They planted me? The job posting you responded to was created by Hargrove's people. The interview process was real, your qualifications are genuine, and nothing about your work was fabricated. But the position itself was engineered to put the right person in front of the right files at the right time. She sat with that for a moment. The logs of her memory reorganized themselves. The strangely easy interview process, the unusual level of system access for a temporary contractor, the way nobody seemed to check on her work or ask for progress reports. Details she had attributed to corporate carelessness suddenly rearranged into something intentional. "The night in the warehouse," she said slowly. "When you took my things and sent me out, that was the only way to make you disappear before Hargrove's people could get to you. If I had kept you inside the organization, they would have known exactly where you were. If I had sent you away with your identity intact, they would have tracked you within hours. Stripping you of everything and pushing you out with nothing was the fastest way to make you invisible, while I built a new identity to move you under." "You could have told me." "If I had told you, you would have had information that made you a target even without the ledger files. Your safety depended on you genuinely believing you were alone." Saffron looked at the fire. The logs had burned down to a deep orange glow, pulsing with heat. She could feel it on her knees and her forearms and the side of her face closest to the hearth. "What is the syndicate matrimonial seal?" she asked. Derek opened the leather folder on his knee. Inside was a single document, printed on heavy, cream-colored paper with an embossed border. He held it out to her. "An old-world protection contract. It dates back 3 generations in my family's organization. When a seal is filed under someone's name, that person is placed under the permanent, legal, and physical protection of the household that issued it. Anyone who threatens, detains, or harms the sealed individual is considered to be in direct conflict with the entire organization." Saffron took the document. Her new name, Mara Ellison, was printed at the center in formal script, directly beneath Derek's full name and a series of signatures she didn't recognize. "You filed this the night you sent me away," she said. "Within the hour." She looked up from the paper. His eyes were steady, reflecting the firelight in small, amber points. He sat perfectly still in the armchair, hands resting on his knees, watching her read the document that bound her safety to his name. "Why?" she asked. "You'd known me for 3 weeks. Most of that time, I was just a name on a contractor list. Why would you do all of this for someone you barely knew?" Derek held her gaze. "You stood in front of me with no leverage, no protection, and no way out, and you told me the truth. You could have lied. You could have played ignorant and walked out with the drive still in your pocket. Instead, you looked me in the eye and told me exactly what you'd found." He paused. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear. You told me what was real. I wasn't going to let anything happen to you after that." Saffron held the document in her lap and stared at the embossed border, tracing its edge with her fingertip. The fire popped and sent a small shower of sparks up the chimney. She had come into this conversation ready for confrontation, ready to demand answers and assert control, and make it clear that she was not a woman who could be managed from a distance. And she had done that. She had said what she needed to say. But sitting here now, in the warmth of a library that smelled like old books and salt air, across from a man who had dismantled his own empire's internal threat to keep her safe, the anger she had been carrying began to lose its edges. She set the document on the reading table and looked at him. "I left the ring in Philadelphia," she said. "I know." "I'm not someone who can be bought, Derek." "I know that too." He leaned forward slightly. "That ring wasn't a purchase. It was a question. One I'm not going to ask until you're ready to hear it." The ocean filled the silence between them, steady and patient, the same way it had been filling this coastline for 1,000 years. Saffron picked up her book and opened it to the page she'd lost. "Stay," she said, without looking up. "If you want." Derek settled back into the armchair, and for the first time in 10 days, they sat in the same room without walls or distance or secrets between them. The fire burned low, and the night pressed against the windows, and neither of them moved to leave. Morning came slowly to the Outer Banks, the way it does in places where the horizon is nothing but water and the sun has to climb out of the ocean before it can reach the land. Saffron woke to the sound of gulls and the smell of coffee drifting up the staircase from the kitchen. She lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the waves through the open window. The air was warm and carried salt and the green sweetness of the seagrass on the dunes. She could hear Grace moving downstairs, the soft clink of dishes being set on a tray, the low murmur of a radio tuned to something with a piano. She dressed in a white linen shirt and dark pants from the closet and went downstairs barefoot. The hardwood was cool under her feet. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows in wide, golden rectangles that stretched across the floor and climbed the far wall. Grace was arranging breakfast on the kitchen island: fresh fruit, toast, scrambled eggs, a pot of coffee so strong Saffron could smell it from the hallway. She looked up when Saffron appeared. "Mr. Malone is on the terrace," she said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had opinions about the situation and had decided to keep every single one of them to herself. "Thank you, Grace." Saffron poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it through the back of the house, past the screened porch, and out the French doors that opened onto the oceanfront terrace. The terrace was wide and built from weathered stone, extending from the back of the house to the edge of the bluff where the land dropped away to the beach below. A low wall ran along its perimeter, just high enough to lean against, and beyond it, the Atlantic stretched out in every direction, enormous, blue-gray, alive with light that shifted and broke across its surface like something breathing. Derek was standing at the far end, near the wall, looking out at the water. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and dark trousers, and his hands rested on the stone ledge in front of him. The wind moved across the terrace in warm gusts that carried the sound of the surf up from the beach, and his shirt pressed against his back each time it passed. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the stone. "You're up early," Saffron said. "I haven't slept." She walked to the wall and stood beside him, leaving 2 feet of space between them. She set her coffee on the ledge and looked out at the ocean. The sun was still low, sitting just above the waterline, painting a long gold stripe across the surface that reached all the way to the shore. "Thinking about the board?" she asked. "Thinking about you." Saffron let that sit. She picked up her coffee, took a sip, and set it back down. The wind lifted a strand of hair from her forehead, and she tucked it behind her ear. "I called my sister last night," she said. "From the house phone." First time we've spoken in almost 2 weeks. She thought I was dead, Derek. She filed a missing person report 3 days ago. The police told her there was no record of anyone named Saffron Cole matching my description in any system they could access. I'll make sure the report is resolved. I already told her I'm safe. I told her I'd explain everything when I could. She paused. I didn't know what else to say. How do you explain something like this to someone who lives in the normal world? Derek was quiet for a moment. The waves broke against the base of the bluff in long, rolling crashes that vibrated through the stone under their feet. "You don't," he said. "You tell them what they need to hear, and you carry the rest yourself. That's what this life costs." "Is that what you do?" "Every day." Saffron turned to face him. He was already looking at her. This close, she could see the fatigue around his eyes. Not the kind that comes from one sleepless night, but the kind that accumulates over years of carrying weight that nobody else can see. He looked like a man who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had gotten so used to the burden that he'd forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. "You filed that seal the night we met," she said. "You'd spoken to me for less than 3 minutes. You didn't know anything about me except that I'd found your books and told you the truth about it. And based on that, you decided to put me under your protection permanently, to give me a new name, a new life, and a ring I hadn't asked for." "Yes." "That's insane, Derek." "Probably. I'm serious. Normal people don't operate like this. You don't meet someone for 3 minutes and decide to restructure your entire organization to keep them safe. You don't erase a woman's identity and move her across the eastern seaboard and buy out bus seats and close down offices and pay off student loans because she told you the truth one time in a warehouse." Derek held her gaze. The wind pressed his shirt flat against his chest and pulled at his collar, and the sun threw half his face into warm light and left the other half in the sharp shadow of his own cheekbone. "I know what I did," he said, "and I know how it looks from where you're standing. But I need you to understand something. I have spent my entire adult life reading people, measuring them, figuring out what they want, what they're hiding, and what they'll do when the pressure comes. I have sat across from hundreds of people in rooms exactly like that warehouse office, and every single one of them lied to me. Every one. They lied to protect themselves, to gain advantage, to buy time, to stay alive. And I understood every one of those lies, because I would have done the same thing." He took a breath. The ocean roared below them. "You didn't lie. You had every reason to, and you didn't. And when I looked at you standing there, telling me the truth like it was the only option you'd even considered, I realized I had never met anyone like you. And I wasn't going to wait around for life to take that away." He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box, different from the one in Philadelphia, darker, simpler, worn at the corners as though it had been carried for a while. He opened it and held it out to her. Inside were 2 rings, a gold band set with a single emerald, identical to the one she'd left behind, and beside it a matching band, plain gold, unadorned, sized for his hand. "The protection seal keeps you safe," he said, "legally, permanently, regardless of what you decide right now. That doesn't change. Your new identity is yours. This house is yours. Your freedom is yours. None of that is conditional." He held the box steady between them. "This is a different question. This is me asking you to stand beside me, to share what I've built, to be my wife and my equal, and the one person in my life who will always tell me the truth, even when I don't want to hear it." The wind wrapped around both of them. The ocean filled the silence with its ancient, patient rhythm. Gulls wheeled overhead, white against the pale blue sky, calling to each other in sharp, bright voices. Saffron looked at the rings. She looked at the man holding them. She thought about a warehouse office in New York, and a cup of burned coffee in a diner, and a bus ticket under a name she'd never chosen, and a library full of books that smelled like salt and thyme. She thought about every invisible hand that had guided her across 1,000 miles to this exact spot on this exact morning, standing on a stone terrace above the Atlantic with a man who had dismantled his own world to keep her safe. She reached into the box and picked up the emerald ring. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, turning it in the light. The stone caught the sun and threw a small green spark across her knuckle. Then she picked up the plain gold band and held it out to him. "If I'm wearing one," she said, "you're wearing one." Derek looked at the band in her hand, and for the first time since she had known him, across all the distance and silence and invisible architecture of the past 11 days, he smiled. A real smile,
full and unguarded and so transformative that it made him look like an entirely different man. A man unburdened. He took the ring from her fingers and slid it onto his own hand. Saffron put the emerald on her finger. It fit perfectly, the way everything he had chosen for her fit perfectly, as though he had studied the dimensions of her life down to the millimeter. They stood together at the edge of the terrace, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the Atlantic. The sun climbed higher. The water turned from grey to blue. The wind carried salt and warmth and the sound of a world that was, for the first time in 11 days, completely still. Saffron leaned her shoulder against his arm. "So what happens now?" she asked. Derek looked down at the gold band on his finger, then out at the endless reach of the ocean, then at the woman standing beside him who had walked out of his warehouse with nothing and arrived here with everything. "Whatever you want," he said. "That's the whole point." The waves rolled in beneath them, steady and sure, carrying the morning forward.